I love that gap of time between when something is cool, is fresh and new, and then starts to recede into our memories. Then after a time, people rediscover it and pick it back up again and revisit it as retro. We're always in the midst of articles that declare that X is making a comeback. What is often true is that it never went anywhere. It's just that we're talking about a zeitgeist followed by a potential second zeitgeist many years later. In music, it depends on the genre, but in club music, the first zeitgeist is usually 6 months to a year. In rock and pop, it can be about 2 years if it's lucky. And then the second zeitgeist really depends. Articles that say X is making a comeback usually refer to some maxim about music comes in 12-year cycles, or 8-year cycles, or 20-year cycles. I think it just happens when it happens. It seems to be an intersection of nostalgia from the people who were part of its first wave and a younger generation who discover it as a novelty. I'm interested in that valley between the peaks, but I'm especially interested in that moment when something is most uncool, like maybe 5 to 8 years after something breaks, after its peak moment in the music press, and it's at its most forgotten point. Lately, the music that I've been feeling a complicated sort of nostalgia for is Hauntology. I know that Hauntology is just obscure enough that it's worth explaining, but I don't want to do a whole video about this genre. That video could easily be 5 hours long and still, to people like me, leave important things out. And you can easily Google it and get a far less idiosyncratic definition than I could give. The thing about genres and genre titles, I generally hate them. They're useful to talk about categories, but I find them ultimately meaningless. And in the cases of like shoegaze, krautrock, or djent, I think they're terrible. However, I think hauntology is not really a genre, but an interesting way to describe something intrinsically vague. The word hauntology comes from Marx by way of Derrida, but began to be used around the mid-aughts by writers like Adam Harper and Simon Reynolds and Mark Fisher to describe a theme they perceived in the work of artists across disciplines, but I want to focus on the music. So artists like Boards of Canada and Burial, Broadcast, The Caretaker, artists on the Ghostbox label like The Focus Group, Bellbury Polly, The Advisory Circle, and an artist I'll talk about more later, the Moonwiring Club. These artists create a temporal disjunction where the music feels vintage, but from a time that never existed. They are shadows of a forgotten time that nobody ever lived through. One common theme between these artists is employing vintage synths to create what was once the sound of the future, but are now just vintage. When defining genres, there's always a lot of argument about what is and isn't part of that genre. And hauntology is no different. And because it's not really a scene or a specific sound, but an approximation of a feeling or an idea, the arguments are very strewn with words and ideas you would need a postgraduate degree to participate in. And I think that reflects poorly on the music. And it's a music that really isn't very pedantic or academic at all. I hate genre names like shoegaze, but I like hauntology's formulation. I don't know that it is a genre, but it describes a collective gesture by a group of artists that are maybe not necessarily otherwise able to be grouped together. However, you can listen to the Hauntology station on Spotify, and I don't know if I can make sense of what's there. The greatest omission from that station is not Spotify's fault, though, because The Caretaker is not available on Spotify. I probably listen to The Caretaker more than any other music. In short, as The Caretaker, James Leland Kirby places us in the Overlook Hotel, the haunted ski lodge in Kubrick's The Shining. In the cold stillness of the empty hotel, you hear music coming from far down the hall. Maybe from another floor, maybe from another era, displaced from time, place, source, and genre. It seems to mourn for its own displacement. The caretaker. Jack Torrance is corrected. "I'm sorry to differ with you, sir, but you are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker." The word nostalgia refers to a kind of homesickness, a longing for a time or a place you can never return to. And that, to me, is what hauntology refers to. When talking about music, within nostalgia, within looking back, there is this longing for something absent, something fictional. And isn't that how memory works? By filling in the gaps with artifice? Ironically, lately, I've been feeling nostalgic for hauntology. I've recently started doing no-screen Sundays, where I try to spend the whole day without devices, and those days have left me in this weird, in-between non-state, because I pretty much got rid of all of my physical media. But I still fetishize physical books. As an aside, I say this just as the vinyl of my band, My Heart in Inverted Flames vinyl, just became available online. So this last Sunday, I was reading the book The Most Unusual Cat in the Village, which is a picture novel by Ian Hodgson, aka Moonwiring Club, the music project I referred to earlier. The Most Unusual Cat in the Village is a book, but Moonwiring Club also released music to accompany the book, but only released it on vinyl. So I'm in this in-between state with my media, where a music project that evokes a non-specific, non-historical past that overlays obliquely on our own world is upholding classic, increasingly outdated technology. Because I don't buy vinyl, and I wouldn't buy the corresponding album to The Most Unusual Cat in the Village, I settled for listening to a mix that Moonwiring Club made for Ponton about 10 years ago while I sat and read the book, as a sort of soundtrack. For me, the magical thing about the DJ mix is that duration, or that moment when the two songs meet in the mix. When they are recontextualized atop one another or beside each other, they create a third song. Either literally because they are superimposed upon one another, or contextually because by their temporal proximity, they create a narrative. The two statements create a context between them. And in this Moonwiring Club mix, where his deeply eclectic mixtape combines movie dialogue and obscure tracks that make only the most poetic sense in procession, a narrative emerges that is fictitious. They combine to form a music that's out of space and out of time, even though the components actually exist in the here and now. Like, if you were to mix two minimal techno tracks, you'd have a third emergent piece of music that had never existed before. But sometimes a series of songs can be combined to create something completely other. Like, imagine a collage of magazine clippings of flowers that combine to form a face or a portrait. Something that I think is notable, while talking about the uncool valley, when thinking about hauntology, is that Ghostbox, the label, just put out a Beautiful Junkyards album that I think is one of the best things on the label. And James Leland Kirby, the caretaker, finished his Everywhere at the End of Time series about a year ago, and I think it's his best work. And notably, he seems to be getting the most traction of his career as kids are making reaction videos to his music on TikTok. I think part of the original emergence of hauntology was that as all things become available, like being able to instantly stream an obscure sitcom from your childhood, or download old minimal wave cassettes from the 80s, or collect long-forgotten British library music, there exists a longing, a nostalgia for a past that we can't so easily access. Part of nostalgic longing is for something that is lost. But if everything is always present all the time, there perhaps becomes a need to create a past that will always be half-remembered, like a faded photograph, or to create art, or a fictional world that is more like our muddy recollections than a pristine digital copy of its artifacts. There is an old mansion house, silhouetted through wintered trees, and a mausoleum staircase made entirely of stone in the middle of an ancient forest. It is as if several photographs have been simultaneously exposed together as one, and you are traveling inside them. I should note that the publisher's page of this book says, first published in 1596. So I find myself having nostalgia for Burial and Belbury Polly and the Focus Group and Broadcast, but I can listen to them anytime, and many of those artists are making their best work right now. There are two notable exceptions, though, as far as the nowness of the category of hauntology. The first is Trish Keenan of Broadcast, who tragically died of pneumonia in 2011. And also the writer Marc Fisher, one of my favorite writers, who took his own life 3 years ago. Via his blog K-Punk, Marc Fisher was instrumental in defining hauntology. And in an essay discussing The Shining, both the Stephen King novel and the Kubrick interpretation, but not too distant from The Caretaker, he sums up this vague, open-ended idea as best as I can find. In Spectres of Marx, Derrida defines hauntology as the study of that which repeats without ever being present. To elaborate, we might say that the revenant repeats without time. Nothing occupies the point of origin, and that which haunts insists without existing.